It began in a tent, under a sky filled with stars that had no names yet. In the cold breath of the Anatolian steppe, a horseman dreamed a tree would rise from his chest, its branches shading the world. This is the story of Osman, the son of Ertugrul, and the dream that launched 6 centuries of empire. It is a story born in the dust of a borderland, the frontier between collapsing empires and unclaimed futures. In the late 13th century, Anatolia was a land of ruins and warlords. The once great Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had fragmented, and the Mongols thundered through the east, casting long shadows over everything. Osman was not born a sultan. He wasn't born into power. He was the leader of a small Turkic tribe of warriors, the Kaya, who lived on the edge of the Byzantine world. They were Ghazis, frontier fighters for Islam, but also opportunists, raiders, and settlers. Osman's authority came not from gold or armies, but from charisma, faith, and the blade of his sword. The legend tells us this one night. Osman dreamed he lay beside a holy man, Sheikh Edebali, whose daughter he loved. In the dream, a moon rose from her chest and settled into his. From that moon grew a massive tree, its roots in the earth and branches touching the sky. Its shade spread across the world. When he awoke, Osman was promised the hand of Edebali's daughter and the blessing to rule. Historians debate whether this dream actually occurred, or whether it was a later myth written to give spiritual legitimacy to the dynasty. Some scholars argue the story was invented in the 15th century to align the Ottomans with divine prophecy, just as European monarchs claim descent from Troy. Others suggest the dream reflects real Sufi visions and symbolic storytelling common to that time. Whether myth or memory, the dream became the founding story of the Ottoman Empire. By 1299, a date both embraced and contested, Osman declared his independence from the crumbling Seljuks. It wasn't a declaration in marble halls or royal courts, but in the smoky council of a tent, perhaps surrounded by elders and swords. He began seizing small Byzantine fortresses like Bilicik and Yenishehir, capitalizing on the internal divisions of the Byzantine state. Unlike empires before him, he didn't merely raid, he settled. He governed, and he promised protection to both Muslim and Christian villagers. Osman's rise was quiet, not thunderous. There were no world-shaking battles in these early years, just the slow, relentless expansion of a tribal chieftain into a monarch. His warriors, loyal through kinship and religion, carved out a new order in a land of collapsing powers. And slowly, the word spread, a new power was forming in the west of Anatolia, and it was moving like smoke into the cracks left by Rome and Seljuk alike. What set the Ottomans apart in these early years was their adaptability. They embraced the bureaucratic systems of the Seljuks, the military structures of the Byzantines, and the spiritual legitimacy of Islam. Osman's court may have spoken Turkish, but his scribes used Arabic script. His warriors followed Turkish customs, but his diplomacy followed Persian models. His dream, like his empire, would become a fusion east and west, tradition and innovation. Some historians argue that Osman's state was not yet an empire, not in size, not in formality. It lacked the institutions and centralization of later Ottoman rule. But what it did have was momentum. A new kind of state was forming, one that didn't collapse after the death of its founder. As so many tribal confederacies had before, it had staying power. Osman died sometime around 1323 or 1326, depending on the source. He likely never saw the empire's first real capital, Bursa, fall into Ottoman hands. That glory went to his son, Orhan. But Osman's burial in Bursa became a pilgrimage site for centuries. His tomb still stands today, modest in size but monumental in meaning, for it marks the grave of a man who may have begun with nothing but a sword, a horse, and a dream. What he left behind was a legacy that would echo for over 600 years. By the time Osman passed into legend, his son Orhan inherited more than a band of frontier warriors. He inherited momentum. Orhan Ghazi, the second ruler of the Ottoman dynasty, would transform the loose tribal confederation into something more durable. His rule laid the foundations of an enduring state. Coins were minted in his name. Fortresses were seized from the Byzantines. and a capital city emerged in the rolling hills of northwestern Anatolia. Orhan's early reign was defined by opportunity. The Byzantine Empire, once the mightiest force in Christendom, had withered into a pale shadow of itself torn by civil wars, weakened by Latin occupation, and gasping under economic decay. The Ottomans weren't alone in pressing against its borders, but they were among the most agile. In 1326, Orhan took the walled city of Bursa, a significant triumph, not just for its strategic value, nestled at the foot of Mount Uludağ, but for its symbolic resonance. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital, a city of mosques and markets, schools and tombs. It was no longer just a base for raiding. It was the heart of a growing civilization. One of Orhan's defining contributions was the introduction of formal institutions. Under his reign, the Ottomans established the Divan, a council to advise the ruler. The Qaida system of judges began to spread, ensuring legal governance in both Turkish and non-Turkish lands. Coins were minted bearing the Arabic inscription Orhan bin Osman, linking the Ottoman name with Islamic authority. Yet perhaps most remarkable was how Orhan handled cultural and religious pluralism. The people of newly conquered territories, many of them Christian Greeks and Armenians, were not slaughtered or forcibly converted. Instead, they were taxed, protected, and allowed to worship freely. This was no act of charity. It was pragmatic empire building. Conquerors had learned long ago that stability often came through tolerance, not terror. And then came one of the oddities of Ottoman rule, the rise of the dervishes. These mystic Sufi preachers were granted land and tax exemptions under Orhan's rule. In return, they built techies lodges, offered spiritual guidance, and often softened the harshness of conquest with mystic poetry and kindness. It wasn't uncommon for a village to be conquered by Ottoman troops in the morning, and offered food and spiritual consolation by dervishes that same night. Historians still debate whether these early Ottoman conquests were religiously motivated jihads, or merely pragmatic land acquisitions cloaked in the language of piety. On one hand, the Ottoman rulers used Islamic legitimacy to rally warriors and justify expansion. On the other, their methods were often diplomatic, syncretic, and surprisingly accommodating. Some argue that the Ghazi image, the sword-wielding warrior for Islam, was more marketing than creed, a story told to inspire recruits and allies. What is certain is that Orhan built an army capable of expansion beyond Anatolia. He introduced salaried soldiers, a significant departure from the old tribal loyalty model. These men were loyal not to a chief, but to a state, and he began flirting with the idea of a permanent military corps, something that would later evolve into the elite Janissaries. In 1354, something truly extraordinary occurred. A natural disaster changed history. A powerful earthquake damaged the Byzantine fortress city of Gallipoli, perched on the European side of the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, quick and opportunistic, moved in under Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, and took it. For the first time, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe not as raiders, but as settlers. It was the beginning of something far bigger. And here, another quirky footnote, Orhan's title was not Sultan, as it would be for his descendants. He was referred to as Bey, a chieftain. He never ruled with the grandeur of later emperors, nor did he style himself with imperial regalia. His court remained modest, his language humble, but the machine he built, administrative, military, and cultural, would become the skeleton of an empire. By the time of Orhan's death in the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were no longer a wandering tribe. They had cities, judges, bureaucrats, and markets. They had crossed into Europe, and they had tasted the idea of destiny. Still, questions linger among scholars. Was Orhan a visionary or simply a skilled opportunist? Did he understand that his house would become a dynasty, or was he still thinking in terms of short-term power and tribal survival? The sources are silent, but history is loud. The empire would stretch for centuries, or its roots were now planted. By the time Orhan breathed his last, the Ottoman enterprise had already moved far beyond tribal raiding. The taking of Bursa had signalled the first heartbeat of something new. Now, with the reins of power passing to Murad Ran, the Ottomans would evolve from a frontier principality into a transcontinental empire. The slow pulse of conquest would quicken, the institutions would deepen, and Europe would begin to tremble. Murad I, son of Orhan, grandson of Osman, ruled for 27 years and changed everything. His reign marked the beginning of the Ottoman state as a centralized, organized, and self-conscious empire. His base of power stretched across both Asia and Europe, and his ambitions were no longer limited to border raids. He wanted cities, he wanted systems, and he wanted the future. His early years were shaped by strategic brilliance. In 1361, Murad captured Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, a major city in Thrace, and made it his new capital. This move was both tactical and symbolic. By making a European city the heart of the Ottoman state, Murad sent a message to both enemies and allies. The Ottomans were no longer just an Anatolian power. They were here to stay in Europe. Adrianople, nestled near the Maritsa River, would become a jewel of Ottoman urban planning. Mosques, markets, bridges, and madrasas sprang up under Murad's rule. From here, campaigns into the Balkans would be launched with growing regularity. And yet, the Ottomans didn't just fight, they absorbed. Local Slavic lords who submitted were often allowed to retain their lands in exchange for loyalty and tribute. The system was flexible, and that flexibility bred resilience. It was during Murad's reign that one of the most controversial and most discussed innovations of the Ottoman Empire emerged: the devshirme system. This was the practice of taking Christian boys from conquered Balkan territories, converting them to Islam, and training them as elite soldiers or administrators. These boys, selected for their intelligence and strength, would become Janissaries, the backbone of the Ottoman military for centuries. To modernize, the devshirme system can appear as a cruel form of child conscription, even slavery. But it was also a machine for social mobility and imperial loyalty. Many of these boys rose to become viziers, governors, and generals. They were not the sons of aristocrats, but they would become the ruling class of the empire. Some historians argue that the devshirme prevented a hereditary aristocracy, and thus preserved meritocracy. Others condemn it as a violent mechanism of domination and cultural erasure. Still, its effectiveness cannot be denied. The Janissaries became one of the most disciplined and feared military corps in the world, clad in distinctive uniforms, trained from youth. They fought not for gold or family, but for the state and the sultan who embodied it. Under Murad, the Ottoman legal and military system began to take on a form that would endure for centuries. He established the Beylerbeylik, large administrative provinces, each governed by a Beylerbey, or Bey of Beys. This move helped bring order to a sprawling and multi-ethnic realm. Taxation, conscription, and law could now be applied more systematically. Murad also founded the Divan Humayun, the Imperial Council, which served as both an advisory and judicial body. Decisions of state were no longer purely personal, they were institutional. The empire was no longer a man, it was a machine, but it was a machine forged in blood. As the Ottomans expanded deeper into the Balkans, they clashed with coalitions of Serbs, Bulgarians, Hungarians, and Albanians. The Ottomans were not invincible, but they were relentless. Their use of light cavalry, disciplined infantry, and psychological warfare gave them the edge. And then came a defining moment, the Battle of Maritsa in 1371. A night raid led by Ottoman commanders destroyed a larger Serbian force on the riverbanks, killing thousands and capturing high-ranking nobles. The Ottomans didn't just win, they shattered the morale of their enemies. More Balkan lords submitted, tribute flowed into Edirne, and yet Murad's ambition was still growing. One curious detail: the Ottomans, at this point, still issued coins in Arabic, not Turkish. The court spoke Ottoman Turkish, a fusion of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, but its symbols of legitimacy were still deeply tied to the Islamic world. Some scholars argue this shows the Ottomans were still trying to prove their right to rule. Others see it as strategic, using religious authority to stabilize a secular expansionist agenda. Toward the end of Murad's reign, a new challenge loomed. Prince Lazar of Serbia had united regional lords and raised an army to resist Ottoman encroachment. The stage was set for one of the most mythologized confrontations in Balkan history, the Battle of Kosovo, but that blood-soaked field would be the stage for our next chapter. The Balkans, in the late 14th century, were no longer a buffer zone, they were a battlefield, and the Ottomans, under Sultan Murad I, were no longer outsiders. They had crossed the threshold of empire. With Adrianople as their capital, and a military machine rooted in innovation and institutional order, they set their sights on the fragile alliances and fragmented kingdoms of southeastern Europe. What followed was not just expansion, it was transformation. The Ottomans were not merely conquerors, they were integrators. Local lords who submitted were absorbed, not eliminated. Marriages were arranged, taxes negotiated, and administrative roles shared. Orthodox Christians were granted religious autonomy under the millet system, allowing them to govern their own legal affairs in matters of marriage, worship, and community leadership. This system, surprisingly tolerant by medieval standards, helped the Ottomans manage diversity while reducing rebellion. But the sword remained the final arbiter, and Murad's campaigns into Serbia and Bulgaria were relentless. The turning point arrived in 1389 on the plains of Kosovo. Sultan Murad's army met the forces of Serbian Prince Lazar in what would become one of the most mythologized battles in Balkan history. The Battle of Kosovo remains etched in both Ottoman and Serbian memory, not just for its bloodshed, but for its ambiguity. Estimates of the armies vary wildly. Some accounts claim 12,000 Ottomans and 15,000 Serbs. Others double those numbers. Regardless of the size, the confrontation was brutal. According to Ottoman sources, Murad led his forces with caution but confidence, using his disciplined Janissaries and mobile cavalry to outmaneuver the Serb knights. The result, a tactical Ottoman victory but one paid in blood. Sultan Murad himself was assassinated shortly after the battle, stabbed by a Serbian nobleman, Miloš Obilić, who allegedly approached the Sultan under pretense of surrender. Whether Obilić acted alone, or even existed at all, is still debated. Serbian epic poetry paints him as a martyr. Ottoman chronicles describe the act as treacherous but ineffective. Murad became the only Ottoman sultan to die on the battlefield. His body was buried in Kosovo, but his internal organs were interred on the field itself, marking the symbolic root of Ottoman Europe. A monument still stands there today, known as Murad's Turba. The battle's outcome was complex. While the Ottoman military endured and Prince Lazar was executed shortly after, both sides suffered enormous losses. In Serbia, the battle became a cultural myth of heroic defeat, a narrative of sacrifice, unity, and loss. In Ottoman memory, it was a testament to divine destiny and imperial endurance. But here lies one of the enduring scholarly debates: was Kosovo a victory or a stalemate? Some historians argue that the Ottomans were too weakened to press further for years. Others claim the Balkan states were permanently fractured and more willing to pay tribute than resist. Meanwhile, an unexpected fact around this time: the Janissary Corps elite infantry, originally formed from the Devshirme system, were given a unique privilege. Unlike other soldiers, they were forbidden to marry or own property during service. Their loyalty belonged solely to the Sultan. They even had their own marching music, meta, which would later inspire European composers like Mozart and Beethoven. Ottoman discipline wasn't just military, it was cultural. As Murad's sons fought for succession in the aftermath of Kosovo, it was Bayezid, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt, who emerged victorious. He would avenge his father and launch the empire into its next phase of furious expansion. But Kosovo had revealed something deeper than military power. The Ottomans were now embedded in the European imagination not as visitors, but as permanent actors. Their victories inspired awe, their customs, fear, their governance, grudging respect. The empire was no longer just crossing frontiers, it was redrawing them. Bayezid came to power not through careful succession but by force. After Sultan Murad's death at Kosovo, Bayezid executed his own brother Yaqub to prevent a civil war, establishing a grim but enduring Ottoman custom fratricide to secure the throne. It was brutal, but effective. The Ottoman system was built for continuity, not sentimentality, and Bayezid, called Yildirim the Thunderbolt, would live up to his name. Bayezid was a warrior sultan, His campaigns were swift, sweeping, and deeply strategic. Within a few short years, he expanded Ottoman control through the Balkans, forced the submission of Bulgarian Tsars, pressed into Albania, and even laid siege to Constantinople. He declared himself Sultan of Rum, Sultan of the Roman lands, a title heavy with ambition. The Ottomans were no longer content with being one among many Anatolian beyliks. They were, in their own eyes, the rightful successors to both Rome and Islam, but the Christian world was not yet ready to surrender. In 1396, a vast coalition of European knights, French, Hungarian, German, and Burgundian, launched a crusade under King Sigismund of Hungary to repel Ottoman advances in Europe. The two armies met at Nicopolis on the Danube River in modern-day Bulgaria. The battle was a disaster for the Crusaders. Bayezid's forces used a clever stratagem. Light skirmishers lured the European knights into a premature charge. The heavy cavalry smashed through the initial line, only to find themselves exhausted and isolated. The real Ottoman army waited behind. The disciplined Janissaries counterattacked, and Bayezid's cavalry encircled the Europeans. The result was carnage. Thousands were killed, hundreds captured. Many French knights, including the future Duke of Nevers, were ransomed. Others were executed on Bayezid's orders. And here lies a curious footnote according to chroniclers. Bayezid asked the captured knights why they had invaded his lands. When one replied that it was in defence of Christianity, Bayezid allegedly remarked, "If you defend Christendom with such arrogance, you will lose it entirely." Whether apocryphal or real, the comment reveals Bayezid's attitude. He was not afraid of Christian power. He mocked it. But even as he projected dominance abroad, Bayezid faced challenges at home, in Anatolia. Rival Turkish beyliks still controlled significant territory. Some welcomed Bayezid's rule, others resisted. Rather than relying solely on diplomacy, Bayezid launched a series of brutal campaigns to absorb them. He forced their leaders into submission, often marrying their daughters to cement the alliance. Yet this aggressive centralization also created tension. Some Turkish scholars and Sufi leaders, particularly those aligned with the heterodox sects, viewed Bayezid's rule as too authoritarian, too Arabized, too imperial. The Ghazi spirit of Osman seemed to be giving way to imperial spectacle. Then came the storm from the east. Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, was building a ferocious empire from Samarkand to Delhi. A military genius and brutal tactician, Timur saw Bayezid as both rival and obstacle. The two leaders exchanged increasingly hostile letters, each claiming to be the true protector of Islam. Bayezid had angered Timur by harbouring rivals, while Timur claimed the right to interfere in Anatolian affairs. In 1402 their armies met near Ankara. It was one of the greatest military clashes of the medieval Islamic world. Bayezid's troops were exhausted from a long campaign. Worse, many of the Anatolian soldiers in his army had family ties to the very beyliks that Timur sought to restore. During the battle, some deserted, others simply refused to fight. Timur's cavalry, better organised and fresh from victories in Persia and India, crushed the Ottomans. Bayezid was captured, and here, another detail nearly too strange to believe. Timur reportedly kept Bayezid in an iron cage. Some say he was paraded in humiliation. Others argue Timur treated him with a strange sort of respect. Bayezid died a year later, possibly from illness, despair, or poison. His defeat was catastrophic but not fatal. Historians continue to debate whether Timur's invasion saved Europe from a deeper Ottoman incursion or simply delayed the inevitable. Some argue that without Timur, Constantinople might have fallen in the early 1400s. Others suggest the empire needed this pause, a reset before its golden age. What is certain is that the Battle of Ankara shattered the illusion of Ottoman invincibility. The empire did not collapse, but it fractured. With Bayezid's sons now scrambling for power, a civil war loomed. The thunderbolt was gone, and a dark interlude was about to begin. In the wake of Bayezid's defeat at the hands of Timur, the mighty Ottoman machine came to a jarring halt. The empire had no clear leader, no unified capital, and no path forward. From the ashes of a single catastrophic battle emerged a period of uncertainty and internal war, a 13-year struggle known as the Ottoman Interregnum Fetret Devri, when brother turned against brother and the future of the empire hung in the balance. Bayezid had several sons, each ruling different provinces, in the vacuum left by their father's captivity and death. These princes declared themselves sovereign. The Ottomans, for the first time, were without a universally accepted sultan. It was a house divided, a rare, chaotic moment in an empire otherwise known for its brutal but efficient succession politics. The primary contenders were Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed. Each ruled a piece of the former empire from Anatolia to the Balkans. Each claimed legitimacy, and each sought allies, both among rival Turkish beyliks and foreign Christian powers. The Byzantines, long battered and besieged, exploited the chaos skillfully, playing brothers against one another in exchange for trade privileges and peace. One of the more peculiar details of this period for years, the empire operated with two capitals. Suleiman, who controlled the European side of the empire, made Edirne his base, while his brothers in Anatolia operated from cities like Bursa and Amasya. Diplomats would refer to the Ottoman realm as a plural entity fractured, uneasy, and impermanent. Suleiman, the eldest, initially had the upper hand. With the backing of the Byzantines and control over Rumelia Ottoman Europe, he proclaimed himself Sultan and minted coins bearing his name. But his rule was marked by vanity, extravagance, and poor judgment. He neglected the Janissaries, lost favour among the religious class, and was eventually ambushed and killed by his brother Musa. Musa, who then seized power in Edirne, was a stark contrast pious, disciplined, and ruthless. He reasserted Islamic law and punished those who had cooperated with Christians during Suleiman's reign. But his severity bred enemies. His brother Mehmed, governing from Anatolia, saw an opportunity. Mehmed had remained cautious and calculating during the chaos. Unlike his brothers, he avoided open confrontation at first, consolidating support in the east. He restored relations with the powerful Germanids and Karamanids and won over key Turkish scholars and warriors. Then, with support from Serbian and Byzantine forces ironically, Christian allies aiding a Muslim prince, he marched on Musa. In 1413, at the Battle of Chamurlu near modern-day Bulgaria, Mehmed defeated Musa decisively. Musa was either killed in battle or executed shortly after. With no rivals left standing, Mehmed declared himself the sole ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The interregnum had ended, and with it, the empire was reborn. Yet scholars continue to debate the deeper implications of this fratricidal war. Did the interregnum weaken the empire, leaving it vulnerable and unstable for decades to come, or did it act as a kind of stress test, eliminating weak leaders, refining political practices, and ultimately strengthening dynastic resilience? What's undeniable is that Mehmed the Firman, now known as the Restorer, began the long process of reunification. He didn't just patch borders, he mended institutions. He reinstated tax systems, reaffirmed the authority of Islamic law, and rebuilt trust with both Anatolian and Balkan subjects. His court became known for attracting scholars, poets, and jurists. A new Ottoman identity began to form, one that saw the Sultan not merely as a warrior, but as a just ruler and spiritual protector, one often overlooked but fascinating note during Mehmed's reign. The Ottomans produced their earliest surviving official registers, written records detailing landholdings, taxation, and military obligations. These Tahrir defters would become a defining tool of imperial administration, allowing the empire to manage resources across vast and varied territories. Mehmed died in 1421, having re-established order and legitimacy, but leaving unresolved tensions between tradition and innovation. Was he the last of the tribal sultans or the first of the imperial ones? His son, Murad II, would take that question and the empire to the next level. When Mehmed thus died in 1421, the task of preserving the fragile unity of the Ottoman Empire fell to his son, a 17-year-old named Murad II. Youthful, inexperienced, and immediately faced with multiple revolts. Murad's ascent was anything but secure, and yet, by the end of his reign, the Ottomans would stand on the threshold of a new imperial era, one defined not by tribal survival, but by calculated strength, expanding bureaucracy, and ambition on a global scale. Murad's early years were plagued with rebellion. As soon as he was crowned, a pretender named Mustafa, claiming to be a son of Bayezid, returned from Byzantine exile and declared himself rightful sultan. With support from the Byzantines and various Balkan allies, Mustafa landed in Gallipoli and captured Edirne. The young Murad, facing a fragmented army and internal dissent, had to act fast. What followed was a brilliant and blood-soaked chess match. Murad's forces lured Mustafa into Thrace and ambushed him near the town of Ulubad. Mustafa's own commanders, perhaps bribed or doubtful of his claim, deserted him. He was captured and hanged, a ruthless but decisive end to the first major threat to Murad's rule. Not long after, Murad faced another revolt, this time led by his own younger brother, Küçük Mustafa, in Anatolia. The boy was supported by the Karamanids and other discontented Anatolian beyliks, but the outcome was the same. Küçük Mustafa was captured and executed. Once again, the lesson was clear in the Ottoman world. Brotherhood ended where power began, and yet, Murad's reign was not defined by cruelty. He was a deeply religious man, a patron of poets, and a ruler who longed for peace, but who understood that peace was only secured through overwhelming strength. Under his leadership, the Ottomans consolidated their Balkan holdings, fortified their Anatolian core, and modernized their army. One of Murad's great administrative achievements was the formalization of the Timar system, a method of land grants in exchange for military service. While it had existed before, Murad standardized the process, requiring regular censuses and detailed records of who held what land and how many soldiers they could provide in return. This system allowed the Ottomans to field large, semi-feudal armies without the burden of direct salaries, a crucial advantage in an age of constant warfare. Murad also strengthened the Janissary corps and supported the development of gunpowder artillery. Though still in its early stages, Ottoman engineers began experimenting with cannons and fortification-busting siege weapons, a glimpse of what was to come. And then, in a move that confounded his court and shocked the world, Murad abdicated. In 1444, after securing a major peace treaty with Hungary, and the Christian powers of the Balkans, known as the Peace of Szeged, Murad stepped down and retired to Manisa. He handed power to his 12-year-old son, Mehmed II. Historians still debate why. Some argue Murad was sincere in his desire for a spiritual life to read, pray, and live as a dervish. Others suggest it was a political move, testing the loyalty of the court or preparing the way for his son's rise. Whatever the case, his retreat didn't last long. Christian Europe, seeing an inexperienced boy on the Ottoman throne, violated the peace treaty almost immediately. Led by the Polish-Hungarian king Władysław III and the famed general John Hunyadi, a crusader army marched south. Panic swept through the Ottoman court. Mehmed, too young and untested, begged his father to return, and return he did with force. At the Battle of Varna in November 1444, Murad crushed the Crusaders. Władysław was killed. The Hungarian army was shattered. Murad, having secured his empire once again, resumed the throne. The message was unmistakable. The Ottomans were not to be trifled with, and succession did not mean weakness. A less-known but striking detail from this period, Murad kept a detailed personal library, containing hundreds of volumes in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, including works on mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and Sufi mysticism. He was a warrior and a scholar, a combination the Ottomans would come to idealize. Murad ruled for another 7 years after Varna. His later reign was quieter, marked by building projects, administrative refinement, and ensuring a smooth transition for his now capable son, Mehmed. He died in 1451, buried near his father in Bursa, beneath a modest dome surrounded by roses. His death marked the end of the old Ottoman world, a world of frontier battles and slow consolidation. His son would inherit not just a kingdom, but a fully functioning empire. And within 2 years, that son would do the impossible. The city had stood for more than 1,000 years, a bastion of Christianity, the last breath of the Roman Empire, and the crown jewel of 2 continents. Constantinople was not merely a city, it was a symbol. And in 1453 it would fall not to plague or famine or neglect, but to a 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan named Mehmed II, remembered by history as Mehmed the Conqueror. Mehmed II had inherited an empire poised for greatness but riddled with challenges. Though his father, Murad Sekar, had left behind a functioning bureaucracy and a formidable army, the empire's expansion was stalled. Its European enemies watched warily from the north, while rival Muslim beyliks and the Byzantine remnant still lingered in the west. But Mehmed's eyes were fixed on only one prize, Constantinople. The city had been encircled before by Arabs, Crusaders, and previous Ottoman armies, but its formidable Theodosian walls, triple-layered and studded with towers, had never fallen to a Muslim army. Protected by the Golden Horn and reinforced by a massive chain across its harbour, Constantinople had earned its nickname, the Red Apple always coveted, never taken. Mehmed, however, brought something new: vision, obsession, and gunpowder. The young sultan began preparations in absolute secrecy. In 1452 he constructed Rumeli Hisar, a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the older Anadolu Hisar. The 2 fortresses formed a chokehold, allowing Mehmed to control all sea traffic into the city, effectively strangling Constantinople's trade. But the true innovation was his artillery. Mehmed hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who designed a massive bronze cannon known as the Basilica. It could fire a 600-pound stone projectile over a mile, an unprecedented feat of siege technology. Dozens of smaller cannons were cast, and a corps of engineers was established to transport, maintain, and reload them. In April 1453 the siege began. The Ottoman army, estimated at over 80,000 men, surrounded the city. Inside, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII commanded a garrison of perhaps 7,000 defenders, including Genoese mercenaries, Venetian sailors, and Orthodox volunteers. The odds were uneven, the faith unshaken. The siege lasted 53 days. By day, the Ottoman cannons thundered. By night, engineers filled the city's moats with rubble and built siege towers. The defenders held firm, patching walls with anything they could find: stone, wood, even animal carcasses. Then came one of the most astonishing logistical feats in medieval warfare. Mehmed ordered his men to drag 70 warships overland around the chain-guarded harbour, launching them into the Golden Horn behind the Byzantine fleet. The manoeuvre shocked the defenders. The Ottomans now controlled the harbour, cutting off critical supply lines and morale. Yet, even as the walls trembled and the defenders weakened, Mehmed hesitated. He offered terms of surrender the emperor could leave in peace, the population spared, the churches untouched. Constantine refused. He vowed to die with his city. On May 29th, 1453, just before dawn, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Waves of Janissaries surged forward. The defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, fought savagely, but the breaches could no longer be sealed. According to legend, Emperor Constantine tore off his imperial regalia and charged into battle as a common soldier. His body was never found. By mid-morning the city was lost. Ottoman forces poured through the gates. Looting and chaos erupted, though Mehmed ordered the city to be brought under control by nightfall. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and entered the ancient basilica. He paused beneath its dome, now echoing with prayers and screams, and ordered it converted into a mosque. And then he wept. According to one chronicler, Mehmed murmured verses from Persian poetry as he gazed upon the shattered columns and empty palaces. The spider spins its web in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls in the towers of Afrasiab. A moment of conquest and a moment of mourning. the fall of Constantinople shocked Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire Byzantium was no more. In Christian eyes, it was the darkest day since the fall of Jerusalem. In the Muslim world, it was the fulfillment of prophecy, a holy city brought into Islam, led by a sultan now seen as the shadow of God on earth. But controversy swirls around Mehmed's motives. Some historians argue that he sought more than religious glory, he wanted legitimacy. By capturing Constantinople, he positioned himself not only as an Islamic ruler, but as heir to the Roman Caesars. He began calling himself Caesare Rum Caesar of Rome, and took the double-headed eagle as his imperial emblem. A quirky but revealing footnote, Mehmed ordered that Greek and Latin scholars be spared during the conquest. He collected their manuscripts, translated ancient works into Arabic and Turkish, and invited Christian artists, engineers, and scientists into his court. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a Renaissance man of the East. The city was renamed Istanbul, though it would still be called Constantinople in many foreign languages for centuries. Its churches were converted, its population resettled, and its shattered skyline slowly rebuilt. The Ottomans now had an imperial capital that matched their ambition, and Mehmed, no longer a boy, had become something far more than a sultan. He had become a legend. The fall of Constantinople was not the climax of Ottoman ambition, it was its beginning. With their new imperial capital glimmering on the Bosphorus, the Ottomans were no longer simply a rising Islamic power. They were now an empire in full bloom, stretching across continents and faiths, speaking in many tongues, and governed by one idea order under the Sultan's will. Mehmed II, after capturing Constantinople, turned his eyes towards solidifying Ottoman control over the remnants of Byzantium and the patchwork of Christian and Muslim polities in the Balkans and Anatolia. In the decade following 1453, he conquered the Peloponnese, subdued the Genoese colonies on the Black Sea, and dismantled the last Byzantine successor state, the Empire of Trebizond, in 1461. To the east, he brought the semi-independent Turkish Emirates under central Ottoman rule, including the powerful Karamanids, a centuries-old rival. In the Balkans, he took Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Albania, though the latter was fiercely defended by the legendary Skanderbeg. Even Wallachia, under the brutal and infamous Vlad the Impaler, was brought to heel, though only temporarily. One unexpected detail from this period, Mehmed welcomed Jews and Christians fleeing persecution in Europe, including Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, offering them refuge in Istanbul and other major cities. Ottoman cities became havens of pluralism, where synagogues stood beside churches, and both paid taxes into the imperial treasury. Yet this era of expansion was not without friction. While the Ottomans tolerated religious diversity, they enforced a hierarchical structure, Muslims at the top, non-Muslims protected but taxed, and conversion always incentivized. The millet system, refined during this time, allowed Armenians, Jews, and Greek Orthodox communities to govern their own civil affairs under their own leaders, so long as they acknowledged Ottoman supremacy. Perhaps the most enduring feature of Mehmed's administration was its centralization. He reformed land tenure, tightened control of provincial governors, and began a system of recruiting civil administrators directly from the Devsham Christian boys trained not just as soldiers, but as scholars, diplomats, and architects of empire. Many of them rose to the highest offices, even Grand Vizier. But Mehmed's legacy was also one of brutality. He did not hesitate to execute disloyal governors, rebellious princes, or even close advisors. He established a law that allowed fratricide upon succession, justified as a means of preventing civil war. This decree would haunt the empire's conscience for centuries, but it also contributed to its unusual dynastic continuity. Upon Mehmed's death in 1481, the empire paused and nearly broke. His son Bayezid Seku and his brother Cem fought for control. Cem lost, fled to Rhodes, and eventually became a diplomatic pawn of the papacy. Bayezid's reign, 1481-1512, would contrast sharply with his father's. Where Mehmed had been a conqueror, Bayezid was a consolidator, a man of art, poetry, and relative peace. Bayezid reinforced Islamic scholarship, restored buildings, and slowed the engine of expansion. His court became a centre of Sufi mysticism and Persian-influenced literature. The empire's cultural identity began to crystallise a unique blend of Turkic, Islamic, Persian, Byzantine, and local traditions. A lesser-known but striking fact, Bayezid commissioned the restoration of the aqueducts of Constantinople and reinstituted sanitation systems neglected for centuries. He oversaw the construction of Culier's complexes of mosques, hospitals, schools, and soup kitchens that served as spiritual and social centres for the urban poor. Yet Bayezid's reign was not without conflict. To the east, a new power emerged, the Safavid Empire of Persia, founded by Shah Ismail-Thi. The Safavids were not only militarily ambitious, they were Shia, representing a sectarian challenge to the Sunni Ottomans. The ideological rivalry between the two empires would shape the geopolitics of the Middle East for generations. By the early 1500s, tensions flared. Shia missionaries spread across Anatolia, stoking rebellions among the Turkmen tribes. Bayezid hesitated, while his son, Selim, known as Selim the Grim, argued for harsh retaliation. Their conflict escalated into civil war. Selim overthrew Bayezid in 1512, forcing his father into retirement and death in exile. It was a bloodless coup only in appearance. Many of Selim's brothers and nephews were executed in its aftermath. Selim's reign 1512-1520 would be short but seismic. First, he turned east. In 1514, at the Battle of Chaldiran, Selim's forces crushed the Safavids. The Ottoman victory established firm control over eastern Anatolia and eastern Kurdistan, and demonstrated the strategic superiority of Ottoman artillery over Persian cavalry. But Selim's most astonishing conquest came 3 years later. In 1517 he marched south toward the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks had ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz for centuries. They were guardians of Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, but Selim's disciplined Janissaries and massive cannon train shattered them at the Battle of Ridania near Cairo. The Mamluk Sultan, Tumen Bey II, was executed by Selim's order. In one campaign, the Ottomans had absorbed Egypt, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. And more, the last Abbasid caliph, long a symbolic figurehead under Mamluk protection, transferred the caliphal mantle to Selim. The Ottomans were now not just sultans, they were caliphs of Islam. Some historians dispute this narrative. Was the transfer ceremonial or real? Was the Caliphate an afterthought or a central part of Ottoman religious identity? The sources remain divided. Still, the title stuck, and it gave the Ottomans ideological power to match their imperial reach. By 1517, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to Mecca. Its armies controlled major trade routes. Its cities flourished with artists, architects, and scholars. And it stood on the edge of its greatest century with a new sultan about to claim his place among the immortals. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire began not with a war cry, but with a quiet coronation. In 1520, Suleiman reascended the throne after the sudden death of his father, Selim the Grim. The new sultan was 26 years old, a poet and patron of the arts, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply educated in Islamic law and philosophy. Few could have predicted that his reign would become the longest and most celebrated in Ottoman history. Europe would come to know him as Suleiman the Magnificent. In the Islamic world, he was called Kanuni, the lawgiver. These dual titles captured his essence, a ruler who mastered both the pen and the sword. Suleiman's first years on the throne were anything but passive. In 1521, he launched a campaign against the Kingdom of Hungary and captured Belgrade, a critical fortress that had long resisted Ottoman control. 2 years later, In 1522 he led a massive amphibious assault against the island of Rhodes, expelling the Knights Hospitaller and securing Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Then, in 1526 came the defining moment of his early reign, the Battle of Mohacs. The Hungarian army, led by King Louis II, met Suleiman's forces on the marshy plains of southern Hungary, the Ottomans, outnumbering and outmanoeuvring their opponents, devastated the Hungarian lines with coordinated cavalry, Janissaries, and advanced artillery. Within hours, the Hungarian army collapsed. King Louis drowned trying to flee. The Kingdom of Hungary was shattered. The road to Central Europe lay wide open. Yet here lies a twist. Suleiman did not immediately seize Vienna. Instead, he paused. He fortified Hungary with a puppet ruler, ensured political fragmentation among his enemies, and returned to Istanbul. This strategic patience would define much of his reign. While his campaigns were numerous and often spectacular, Suleiman understood that empire was not just won by battles, but by systems, alliances, and law. Still, he could not resist Vienna for long. In 1529 he launched his first siege of Vienna, bringing with him an army of more than 100,000 men. The Ottomans battered the city's walls with artillery and assaulted its gates for nearly 3 weeks, but supply lines faltered, the weather turned, and the city held. Suleiman withdrew. It was the first major check on Ottoman westward expansion, but it would not be the last word. Back in the heart of the empire, Suleiman turned his energy toward internal refinement. His reign saw the codification of secular and Islamic laws into a comprehensive legal framework, the Qanun. These laws regulated everything from taxes and land tenure to trade and criminal justice. Combined with Sharia, the Qanun provided a flexible yet stable system that endured long after Suleiman's death. His bureaucracy was also reorganized. Grand viziers wielded enormous executive power. The devsham system continued to feed the state with highly trained administrators, and provincial governors were held to stricter accountability through written law and audit. And then there was architecture. Suleiman's reign gave rise to the empire's greatest architect, Mimar Sinan, a former Christian boy recruited through the Devshirme, who became chief architect of the Ottoman court. Under Sinan's hand, the empire flourished with mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and palaces of breathtaking scale and harmony. His crowning work, the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, still stands as a testament to Ottoman sophistication, a fusion of Islamic geometry, Byzantine structure, and imperial ambition. Suleiman was also a prolific poet. Writing under the pen name Muhibi, he composed love poems, religious verse, and philosophical reflections. His literary talent, rarely mentioned in popular accounts, reflected the humanist streak of his court. His love poems were often dedicated to Roxolana, also known as Hürrem Sultan, a former slave girl who became his legal wife and closest confidant. Here lies one of the most unexpected and controversial aspects of Suleiman's reign for the first time in Ottoman history. A woman exerted significant influence over imperial policy. Hürrem broke tradition by living in the palace rather than being sent away after bearing children. She built charitable foundations, advised the Sultan, and positioned her sons for succession. This shift gave rise to what would later be called the Sultanate of Women, a period in which royal consorts and queen mothers shaped court politics and state decisions. Historians still debate whether this influence was beneficial, corrupting, or simply inevitable in a dynastic system where proximity to power was everything. Suleiman's military campaign stretched far beyond Europe. In the east, he waged war against the Safavid Empire, capturing Baghdad and restoring Sunni dominance in Mesopotamia. To the south, his fleets patrolled the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, challenging Portuguese expansion. The Ottomans established suzerainty over the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina, reinforcing their claim to the Caliphate. And yet, even as his empire reached its zenith, Suleiman faced personal tragedy. His beloved son Mustafa, heir to the throne, was accused of treason and executed a decision believed to have been influenced by Hurrem and her faction. The event devastated Suleiman and shocked the court. He spent much of his later years in melancholy and introspection, composing poetry and walking through the gardens of Topkapi Palace. When Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Sigetvar, he had ruled for 46 years. He left behind a realm that spanned 3 continents, contained over 25 million subjects, and operated through an administrative apparatus more sophisticated than any in Europe at the time. His organs were buried near the battlefield, his body returned to Istanbul, and his tomb designed by Sinan became a site of imperial memory. Today, historians still debate his legacy. Was Suleiman the Magnificent a just ruler, lawgiver, and patron of arts? Or was he the first sultan whose court was quietly captured by palace intrigue and dynastic paranoia? The truth, perhaps, lies in the duality of his titles. He was both. With the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566, the Ottoman Empire stood atop the known world. Its borders stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Caucasus Mountains to the shores of North Africa. It ruled over a population more diverse than any empire in Europe: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Kurds, Jews, Persians, and more, all bound under one imperial system. But as the sword gave way to the pen, a new kind of Ottoman governance began to emerge, one built not on conquest, but on continuity. Suleiman was succeeded by his son, Selim II, sometimes mockingly called Selim the Sot for his reputed fondness for wine. Unlike his father, Selim preferred the palace to the battlefield. He delegated power extensively, particularly to his Grand Vizier and to his wife's family, the influential Sokollu dynasty. And here lies one of the most intriguing dynamics of the late 16th century, the growing role of bureaucratic families who, though not of royal blood, effectively ran the empire. Chief among them was Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, a Devshirme-born statesman who served as Grand Vizier under 3 sultans, a master of diplomacy and logistics. Sokollu was the true architect of Ottoman policy during Selim Temu's reign, a time when the Sultanate became as much about administration as imperial will. Selim's brief rule, 1566-1574, did see one significant military victory, the capture of Cyprus from the Venetians in 1571, expanding Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. But this triggered the formation of the Holy League, a coalition of Christian powers led by Spain and the papacy, which culminated in the Battle of Lepanto in the same year. Lepanto was a devastating loss for the Ottomans, their first major naval defeat in centuries. Over 200 Ottoman ships were destroyed, and tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers were killed or captured. European observers hailed the victory as a turning point, a symbol that the Ottoman tide could be turned. And yet, within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet. Lepanto was a symbolic blow, but not a strategic one. The Ottomans retained control over the Mediterranean's eastern half, and their economic networks, stretching into the Silk Road, Indian Ocean, and Black Sea, remained intact. This period marked a fascinating paradox: military stagnation paired with internal flowering. Under Murad III, 1574-1595, the court became a hive of artistic activity. Ottoman miniature painting reached its peak. Poets, calligraphers, and scholars received state stipends. The Topkapi Palace brimmed with scientific manuscripts, Persian verse, and architectural blueprints. Yet Murad III's reign also witnessed increasing signs of administrative strain. One quirky but revealing trend, tulips, became a symbol of courtly elegance and status during this era. Rare tulip bulbs were cultivated in palace gardens, bred in ever more elaborate colours and shapes. they became a luxury item, a metaphor for refinement, and an early symbol of elite identity long before the infamous tulip mania of the 18th century. Meanwhile, the imperial harem gained unprecedented influence. Safiya Sultan, Murad's consort and later the Queen Mother Valida Sultan, became a political force in her own right. She corresponded with foreign monarchs, funded mosque construction, and played a decisive role in court appointments. This was the beginning of the Sultanate of Women, a century-long period in which imperial mothers and consorts helped shape imperial policy from within the palace. Some historians praise this as a form of female agency in a deeply patriarchal world. Others view it as the start of dangerous factionalism that would later weaken the empire's core. What cannot be disputed is that governance grew more complicated. The number of bureaucrats ballooned. Provincial governors had more autonomy. Tax farming or iltizam became widespread, allowing the state to outsource tax collection to private contractors in exchange for upfront payments. While efficient in the short term, this practice encouraged corruption and weakened direct oversight. The empire was also beginning to feel the weight of inflation, driven in part by the flood of silver from the New World. Spanish treasure ships were bringing massive quantities of precious metals into European markets, destabilizing prices across the continent and across Ottoman domains. Wages stagnated, coinage was devalued, bread riots broke out in Istanbul. And yet, despite these pressures, the empire held together. Its secret weapon a vast, adaptable bureaucratic machine. The Defterland registry system allowed detailed tracking of agricultural output and tax obligations. The millet system kept religious communities largely self-governed, and the Devshirme continued to produce loyal administrators with no familial power bases, men who owed everything to the Sultan and the system. Still, signs of stress appeared at the edges. In the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia continued to challenge Ottoman authority. In the west, the Habsburgs probed the Hungarian frontier. Banditry increased in Anatolia. Local notables Ayan began accumulating more land and wealth, threatening the central authority of the Sultan. Perhaps most telling of all was the palace's increasing inwardness. Murad III fathered over 100 children, a logistical nightmare for future succession. The once expansive world of Ottoman sultans, full of military campaigns and public speeches, was shrinking behind the curtains of the harem and the whispers of eunuchs and viziers. When Mehmed III succeeded his father in 1595, he did so by ordering the execution of 19 of his brothers, the single largest act of fratricide in Ottoman history. This bloodbath, while horrifying, was seen as necessary to preserve order and prevent another civil war. But it also marked a psychological shift. The Ottoman dynasty was beginning to fear itself. The empire remained vast, its cities prosperous, its institutions respected. But beneath the polished tiles of Sinan's mosques and the gold-leaf manuscripts of court poets, a quiet tension was building, one that would soon erupt into full-blown crisis. As the 17th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire still appeared formidable. Its maps spanned thousands of miles. Its sultans still carried the titles of Padishah and Caliph. Its cities bustled with trade, learning, and culture. And yet, beneath the surface, the empire was shifting, not collapsing, but cracking. It was entering what historians often call the era of crisis and transformation, a period marked by military overreach, internal rebellions, economic stress, and yet remarkably continued survival. At the heart of this era was a new kind of war, multi-front, perpetual, and draining. The Ottomans were now surrounded by rival empires that had grown stronger, more organised, and more ideologically opposed. To the east stood Safavid Persia, with its Shiite theology and expanding military. To the west, the Habsburgs, entrenched in Hungary and bolstered by increasingly modern European armies. In 1606, the long Turkish War ended with the Treaty of Zitvatorok, a rare diplomatic compromise with the Habsburgs. For the first time, the Ottomans recognised the Habsburg Emperor as an equal, a significant symbolic shift away from their usual assumption of superiority. Though the treaty ended a costly 15-year war, it marked the beginning of a new balance of power. Simultaneously, Anatolia was exploding. Between 1596 and 1610, the empire endured the Salali rebellions, widespread uprisings led by disenfranchised provincial notables, bandits, and former soldiers. The rebellion wasn't just a military problem, it was a sign of deeper dysfunction. The imperial tax system, under strain from war expenses and inflation, could no longer fund salaries or supply armies adequately. Provincial governors became semi-independent warlords. Entire villages were burned, grain prices skyrocketed, confidence in the central state wavered. What's surprising is not that these revolts happened, but that the Ottomans survived them. The empire's secret remained its institutional elasticity. When one system began to fail, the Timar-based feudal army, for example, new models emerged. In this case, the Ottomans began relying more heavily on mercenary infantry, many of them Anatolian or Balkan-born Muslims with no ties to the Devshirme. These irregular troops, known as Sekban and Saraka, filled the gaps left by faltering Janissaries and absentee provincial Timariots. But these new soldiers brought new problems. Unpaid and unregulated, they often turned to banditry. Former soldiers wandered the countryside in gangs, extorting towns and pillaging markets. The Salali rebellions were, in part, the unintended consequence of this improvisation. And yet, from the ashes of rebellion came cultural brilliance. The 17th century saw the rise of what could be called a middle-class Ottoman culture. Cities like Aleppo, Damascus, Sarajevo, and Cairo flourished as centres of trade, textile production, and local governance. Coffee houses became widespread not only in Istanbul but in every provincial town. They were controversial. Some scholars decried them as dens of gossip and sedition, while others praised them as spaces of poetry, politics, and music. One curious detail, the tulip, already a symbol of elite Ottoman aesthetics, became even more popular among the urban middle classes. Entire treatises were written about bulb cultivation. Garden design became a form of self-expression. This seemingly trivial trend reflected a larger shift from a warrior aristocracy to a society increasingly defined by taste, trade, and texts. But the wars did not stop. In the east, the Ottoman-Safavid Wars, especially the 1623-1639 conflict, became a generational struggle. The Ottomans captured Baghdad twice, but could not hold it without constant military presence. The Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 finally stabilised the eastern frontier, roughly defining modern Iraq's borders, but the cost in lives and resources was immense. And then, in 1656, the empire found unexpected leadership in a most unlikely figure, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. The Köprülü family, Albanian in origin, fiercely competent and ruthlessly efficient, would dominate Ottoman politics for the next 30 years. Known as the Köprülü era, this period marked a temporary revival of central authority. Grand viziers like Köprülü Mehmet and his son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed, reorganised the treasury, punished corrupt governors, executed rebellious Janissaries, and restored military discipline. Their campaign saw renewed Ottoman victories in Crete, Transylvania, and against Venice. Under Köprülü leadership, the Ottoman navy reasserted itself in the Aegean, and the army reconquered lost territories in Hungary. But this militaristic energy came at a price: authoritarianism. The Köprülüs ruled with an iron hand, sidelining the sultans, imprisoning dissenters, and enforcing religious orthodoxy. Still, many Ottomans saw it as a necessary correction, a return to discipline after decades of drift. And yet, by the 1670s, a dangerous trend was becoming clear. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite, were becoming a liability. Their numbers had swelled far beyond military need. Many now ran businesses, lived with families, and resisted reforms. Attempts to rein them in led to riots. In 1683, the empire's reliance on this outdated core would be tested at the gates of Vienna again. Before we reach that turning point, consider a curious cultural artifact: Ottoman clocks. By the late 17th century, Ottoman engineers and artisans had begun crafting highly sophisticated timepieces, a sign that the concept of regulated linear time was taking hold in bureaucratic and commercial life. These clocks weren't just novelties, they were used in religious observance, government offices, and palace administration. Time itself was becoming imperial. But imperial ambition was about to outpace imperial capacity. The next campaign, grand in scope, fatal in execution, would mark a critical moment in world history. And Vienna would once again become the city where two worlds collided. At dawn on September 12, 1683, as the sun rose over the plains of Vienna, the fate of two civilizations teetered on a knife's edge. On one side stood the forces of the Ottoman Empire, over 100,000 strong, arrayed in disciplined ranks with Janissaries in the vanguard and siege artillery surrounding the city. On the other stood a last-minute coalition of European armies led by Polish King Jan III Sobieski, charging downhill with cavalry sabres drawn in what would become one of the largest and most decisive cavalry charges in history. This was the Second Siege of Vienna, and it would mark not just a battle, but a turning point, the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe, and the beginning of a long imperial retreat. The Ottomans had first attempted to take Vienna 154 years earlier, in 1529 under Suleiman the Magnificent. That effort had failed due to bad weather and overstretched supply lines. But in 1683, under the leadership of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, they tried again, better supplied, more confident, and with one of the largest armies the empire had ever assembled for a single campaign. Kara Mustafa was not a sultan, but he was a powerful figure handpicked by the Köprülü dynasty to continue the aggressive policies of previous viziers. He was intelligent, ambitious, and ruthlessly pragmatic, but he also bore a fatal flaw: overconfidence. The Ottomans laid siege to Vienna in July 1683. The city, defended by a garrison of roughly 15,000 soldiers and local militias, was under the command of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Though outnumbered, the defenders had one critical advantage: time. They held out while messages for help were sent across Europe. And help came slowly but decisively. By September, a coalition of forces from the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and various German states assembled to relieve the city. The army numbered around 70,000 men, and was led by King Jan Sobieski of Poland, a brilliant tactician and devout Catholic, who saw this as both a religious and political crusade. The final battle occurred on the morning of September 12th. Ottoman forces, though exhausted from weeks of siege and heavy losses, still held the high ground around the city, but they had failed to breach Vienna's inner walls, and their trenches were spread thin. Kara Mustafa, believing reinforcements were days away, delayed a final assault. That delay cost him everything. The European coalition launched a surprise attack at dawn, using infantry and artillery to punch holes in the Ottoman flanks. By afternoon, Sobieski unleashed his famed winged hussars, elite Polish cavalrymen, wearing enormous feathered wings in a massive charge down the Kahlenberg Heights. It was one of the most dramatic cavalry maneuvers in history, smashing through Ottoman lines and triggering a full-scale retreat. The Ottomans fled in chaos. Their camp was looted, their elite troops slaughtered or captured. Kara Mustafa himself escaped but was later executed on the orders of the Sultan for his failure strangled with a silk cord, as befitted a nobleman. And with that, the siege was broken. But the story does not end there. The Battle of Vienna became a mythic moment in European consciousness hailed as the victory of Christendom, commemorated in art, literature, and even cuisine. One of the most enduring legends is that Viennese bakers, inspired by the Ottoman crescent flags left behind, created a buttery pastry in the shape of the crescent moon, the croissant, to celebrate the defeat of the Turks. Whether true or apocryphal, it illustrates how deeply the event resonated. Historians still debate Kara Mustafa's strategy. Some argue that he could have taken the city with a faster, more aggressive assault. Others believe that the Ottomans were doomed by geography and timing, by the sheer difficulty of holding a siege so far from home against an increasingly unified European enemy. More fundamentally, the failure at Vienna marked the end of Ottoman imperial expansion into Europe. No longer the unstoppable juggernaut that had once struck fear into the courts of France and Spain. The empire now faced a new reality: defensive wars, territorial losses, and an evolving military balance it struggled to match. In the years that followed, the Great Turkish War, 1683-1699, would continue to erode Ottoman holdings in the Balkans. The Holy League, now emboldened, pushed deeper into Ottoman territory, capturing Buda, Belgrade, and large swaths of Hungary. This culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, in which the Ottomans ceded significant European territory to Austria, Poland, and Venice. For the first time in centuries, the empire was no longer expanding, it was retreating. But perhaps most telling was the psychological shift. The Ottomans, once feared as divine scourges of Europe, were now seen as beatable, even backward. European observers began referring to the empire as the sick man of Europe, though that specific phrase would gain prominence only later. Inside the empire, the defeat sparked calls for reform, but also a turn inward. The court became more conservative. Religious scholars pushed back against Western influence. Janissaries resisted modernization, and sultans, increasingly sheltered in the palace, grew more reliant on viziers and palace factions. The Golden Age was over, and though the empire would survive for more than 2 centuries more, it would never again stand at the gates of Europe not as a conqueror, but as a fading shadow of its former power. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire still stretched across 3 continents, but the rhythms of power had changed. The sultans no longer led armies into battle, grand viziers no longer ruled uncontested, and beneath the surface of a seemingly stable empire, a slow, subtle transformation was underway from expansion to equilibrium, from conquest to containment. After the disastrous loss at Vienna and the subsequent Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans had, for the first time, ceded large territories to European powers. The empire's strategic mindset shifted dramatically. The focus turned inward to governance, diplomacy, and survival. This new approach began under Ahmed III, 1703-1730, a sultan best remembered not for his wars, but for his love of books, gardens, and tulips. His reign ushered in what historians call the Tulip Era Lal Devri, a fleeting but dazzling period of cultural renaissance, aesthetic refinement, and cautious westernization. Istanbul bloomed literally and figuratively. Palaces were decorated with tulip motifs. Gardens became symbols of sophistication. The elite competed over the rarest tulip bulbs, a craze so feverish it resembled the Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s. But the tulip era was more than a floral obsession. It was an experiment in soft modernity. Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier, Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, encouraged diplomacy with European courts. Ambassadors were sent to Paris, Vienna, and Warsaw, where they marvelled at Western printing presses, libraries, and theatres. In 1727, the Ottomans finally permitted the first printing press in Arabic script, operated by Ibrahim Mutaferrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam. It was a revolutionary, though controversial, step forward. Yet opposition brewed. Religious scholars, the ulama, resisted these reforms, seeing them as corruptions of Islamic tradition. Janissaries, increasingly entrenched as a conservative force, resented the rise of courtly elites with no military background, and ordinary people, suffering under rising taxes and food shortages, viewed the opulence of the palace as an affront to justice. In 1730, this tension exploded into the Patrona Halil Rebellion, a violent uprising led by a former Albanian janissary who denounced the Sultan's extravagance. Tulip gardens were torn up, palaces were looted, Ahmed III was forced to abdicate. His successor, Mahmud Fana, returned to more conservative rule. And yet, even in this unstable environment, the empire continued to function. The Ottomans fought intermittent wars with Persia, Austria, and Russia, winning some and losing others. A significant and surprising victory came in the Russo-Turkish War of 1735-1739 when Ottoman forces, under French-trained commanders, managed to halt Russian advances and retain control over parts of the Black Sea. Still, the military equation was changing. European powers were rapidly modernizing. Prussia introduced conscript armies and mobile artillery. France embraced Enlightenment doctrines and scientific engineering. Russia, under Peter the Great and Catherine II, expanded aggressively, often at the empire's expense. Meanwhile, the Ottoman military had become stagnant. The Janissaries, once the most feared infantry corps in the world, were now bloated, undisciplined, and often corrupt. Many were no longer recruited through the Devshirme, but were sons of previous Janissaries, a hereditary military caste resistant to change. They meddled in politics, refused training reforms, and protected their privileges with violence. Some sultans tried to challenge them. Selim III of 1789-1807, for example, launched the ambitious Nizam-e-Sedid New Order reforms. He attempted to build a modern army modelled after European standards, complete with uniforms, new drills, and foreign advisors. He introduced new taxes to fund these efforts, supported scientific education, and even formed an embassy corps to study European administration. But the Janissaries and their allies in the religious establishment saw this as a threat. In 1807 they revolted, overthrew Selim, and imprisoned him. A year later, he was murdered in his cell. His reforms died with him for the moment. One lesser-known but intriguing fact during this era: a group of Ottoman polymaths known as Munichimbashalar, chief astrologers, also served as astronomers, historians, and weather predictors. While modern science was being imported slowly from Europe, many within the empire still consulted these scholars for imperial decisions, harvest predictions, and even military campaign timings. The old and new coexisted awkwardly. Meanwhile, power at the top remained elusive. Many sultans were young, inexperienced, or sickly. Palace intrigue dominated decision-making. Some sultans were so detached from affairs of state that they became known as cage sultans, living much of their lives in the cafes, a secluded section of the Topkapi Palace designed to prevent succession disputes by isolating potential heirs. One of the most poignant examples was Mustafa III at 1757-1774, a reform-minded ruler who recognized the empire's weaknesses but could not overcome the entrenched forces resisting change. He lamented in verse, "The world's order is broken, the powerful mock the just, the wise are silent, and the ignorant rule." Yet despite all this, despite rebellions, military defeats, and administrative inertia, the Ottoman Empire did not collapse. It adapted, compromised, re-centralized, and bought time. Why? Because its administrative skeleton remained strong. Provincial governors often drawn from loyal local elites, a functioning tax system, religious tolerance under the millet model, and a surprisingly resilient bureaucracy kept the machine running. But by 1798 the world changed overnight. That year, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Ottoman Egypt not merely to conquer, but to disrupt. He brought with him not just cannons, but printing presses, engineers, and scientists. His goal was to sever British trade with India, destabilise the Ottomans, and export the ideals of the French Revolution. Napoleon's invasion failed in the long run, but its shockwaves were irreversible. For the Ottomans, it was a jolt of reality that their empire, though still vast, was vulnerable to ideologies, technologies, and powers they had long ignored. The 18th century had been one of shadows of sultans in retreat, palaces of illusion, and bureaucrats preserving order in an empire afraid of its own fragility. The 19th century would be different. It would begin with war, lurch toward reform, and race toward the storm of modernity. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a dilemma sharper than any it had yet encountered: survive as it was or be dismantled by the modern world. The empire's institutions still functioned, its population still vast, but it was increasingly clear that time was running out. The industrialized West, driven by Enlightenment thought, scientific progress, and colonial ambition, had entered a new phase of history. The Ottomans, if they were to avoid dismemberment, would have to do the unthinkable. Change everything. But change in an empire defined by centuries of religious authority, rigid military hierarchy, and bureaucratic complexity was a perilous game. The first to try was Selim III, 1789-1807, a sultan with one foot in tradition and the other in reform. Well versed in French and Persian literature, a student of politics and law, Selim understood the stakes. He saw how European armies moved faster, fired more accurately, and trained more uniformly. He knew the empire's Janissary corps was bloated and obsolete, and he knew diplomacy would not save a military that could no longer win. So he launched the Nizam-e-Jadid, the New Order. It wasn't just a new army, it was a new idea of the state. Selim sought to build a Western-style military corps trained by European officers, dressed in European uniforms, and drilled using modern tactics. He established military schools, imported scientific textbooks, and sent envoys to Paris and Vienna to study administration and technology. To fund these reforms, Selim introduced new taxes on monopolies, guilds, and commercial transactions taxes that enraged entrenched interests. Most dangerously, he attempted to sideline the Janissaries, stripping them of certain privileges and promoting new order troops to higher salaries and ranks. The reaction was swift. In 1807, the Janissaries revolted. Backed by conservative religious leaders and palace officials, they marched on Topkapı Palace, declared Selim a heretic, and forced him to abdicate. A year later, he was strangled in prison, a grim fate shared by many reformers in the Ottoman story. But Selim's vision did not die with him. Enter Mahmud II, or 1808-1839, the man who would succeed where Selim had failed not by moderation but by force. Mahmud understood power. He was a shrewd tactician who pretended to appease the Janissaries while carefully plotting their destruction. He rebuilt the New Order army quietly under a different name. He placed loyal generals in command. He gained the support of religious authorities by framing reform as restoring true Islamic governance, not importing foreign ideas. Then, in 1826, he made his move. In what became known as the Auspicious Incident, Mahmud ordered his loyal troops to surround the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. When the Janissaries resisted, he bombarded them with artillery. Thousands were killed. Survivors were hunted down, exiled, or executed. The Janissary corps, once the pride of the empire, was abolished overnight. It was one of the boldest acts in Ottoman history, and it cleared the way for reform on a scale previously unimaginable. Mahmud began dismantling the medieval structure of the empire. He abolished the Timar land grant system, centralized tax collection under salaried bureaucrats, and eliminated the provincial military fiefs that had long acted as quasi-independent power bases. One unexpected but powerful symbol of this transformation clothing. In 1829, Mahmud issued a decree requiring civil servants, soldiers, and religious officials to wear European-style trousers and jackets, and the fez-a-round, brimless hat instead of the traditional turban. It was more than a fashion choice. It was a declaration that the Ottoman state would now be modern, uniform, and secular in function, if not in spirit. But modernization brought new enemies. Religious conservatives saw Mahmud's reforms as Western pollution. Bureaucratic elites feared loss of privilege, and ethnic and regional groups from Arab sheikhs to Kurdish chieftains to Balkan Christians began to see the empire not as a multi-ethnic protector but as a centralizing, alienating force. The empire's grip on its far-flung provinces began to loosen. In Greece, a revolution erupted in 1821. Fueled by Enlightenment ideals, Orthodox nationalism, and European Philhellenism, the Greeks fought a brutal war of independence. The Ottomans, with Egyptian help, tried to crush the rebellion, but European powers intervened. In 1827, British, French, and Russian fleets destroyed the Ottoman-Egyptian navy at Navarino Bay, a catastrophic loss from which Ottoman naval power never fully recovered. By 1830, Greece had gained full independence. It was a devastating precedent. Then worse, Egypt rebelled. Led by Muhammad Ali Pasha, the ambitious Ottoman governor of Egypt, a powerful and modernized Egyptian army swept north into Syria and Anatolia in the 1830s, defeating Ottoman forces and threatening Istanbul itself. Only the intervention of Britain and other European powers stopped him. Ironically, it was the foreign threat that made Mahmud's reforms even more urgent. One quirky but important outcome, Mahmud began the empire's first population census, gathering data not only for taxation and conscription, but for central planning. For a state that had long ruled without precise demographic knowledge, it was a revolutionary and symbolic act of modernization. Still, Mahmud died in 1839 before completing his reforms. But his legacy was clear. The Ottoman Empire could no longer rely on its old foundations. If it wished to survive the 19th century, it would have to reinvent itself legally, militarily, and ideologically. His son, Abdülmecid Öztürk, would carry that torch into the next phase one that would shake the empire to its roots. A new word was about to dominate Ottoman life. Tanzimat reorganization. When Abdülmecid ascended the throne in 1839, he inherited not only an empire in turmoil, but also a roadmap. His father, Mahmud II, had broken the Janissaries, restructured the tax system, and laid the foundations for centralization. But now came the more difficult work, remaking the empire's identity itself. The Ottoman world was shifting under its own feet from the old Islamic warrior state to a modern bureaucratic polity, one that had to accommodate not just Muslims but also Christians, Jews, and other minorities across vast territories. The problem wasn't just governance, it was legitimacy. How could the empire survive as a multi-ethnic, multi-faith state in an age of nationalism and Enlightenment values? The answer, at least in theory, was Tanzimat reorganization. On November 3rd, 1839, the Sultan's ministers read aloud the Gülhane Edict, a bold proclamation from the Rose Garden of Topkapı Palace. It promised equality before the law, the security of life and property, regular taxation, and fair conscription. For the first time in centuries, non-Muslims were formally guaranteed protection and legal parity. It was a seismic shift. The Tanzimat aimed to transform subjects into citizens, not by stripping away religion, but by building a shared sense of Ottoman identity, the ideology known as Ottomanism. The goal was simple: prevent the further breakup of the empire by integrating Christians and Jews into the Ottoman political order. But implementation was anything but simple. New civil courts were created to supplement Sharia courts. A new penal code was modelled after the French legal system. Civil service exams were introduced. In 1856, a second proclamation, the Hatta Humayun, reinforced the promises of equality, banning discriminatory taxes and allowing non-Muslims to serve in the military and civil administration. This created an immediate backlash. Religious scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim, were horrified. Many Muslims saw the reforms as a betrayal of Islamic law. Christian patriarchs feared the loss of communal autonomy, and average citizens were confused if a Muslim could now be tried by a Christian judge or serve in a mixed army. What did that mean for centuries of identity and hierarchy? And yet, on paper, progress was remarkable. Ottoman schools began teaching science, geography, and foreign languages. Secular education institutions, Rushdiye and Idadiye schools emerged, often staffed by foreign instructors. In 1863, the Galatasaray Imperial High School was founded in Istanbul, offering a bilingual French-Turkish curriculum that trained future diplomats, journalists, and politicians. One quirky but fascinating note, this was the era when the fez, once introduced by Mahmud Sek, became a compulsory symbol of modern Ottomanness. It was worn by Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, a round, brimless hat meant to erase religious distinctions in clothing and project a unified civic identity. Ironically, it became a symbol of conformity rather than unity. Economically, the empire began to open itself to the global capitalist system. Railroads were built often by French and British companies. Telegraph lines connected Istanbul to Baghdad and Cairo. Steamships replaced galleys. The Ottoman lira was introduced in 1844, replacing older coinage systems with a modern decimal currency. But all this came at a cost debt. To finance reforms, the Ottomans borrowed heavily from European banks. By the 1870s, the empire was deeply indebted to foreign creditors, particularly in France and Britain. The Public Debt Administration, formed later, would effectively give Europeans control over vast sectors of Ottoman revenues, customs, tobacco, and salt. And then came war again. In 1853, the empire clashed with Russia in the Crimean War, a conflict that began over the control of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, but quickly escalated into a pan-European showdown. With British and French support, the Ottomans held their ground. The war ended in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris, which reaffirmed Ottoman territorial integrity and declared the empire part of the continent of Europe. This was both a diplomatic victory and a trap. European powers now claimed a right to interfere in Ottoman affairs under the guise of protecting religious minorities. Russia, France, and Britain competed for influence among Armenians, Maronites, Orthodox Christians, and others, turning internal Ottoman diversity into a stage for international power politics. And this created tensions within. In the Balkans, Christian peasants demanded land reform and autonomy. In Syria and Lebanon, sectarian violence erupted most tragically in the 1860 Damascus massacre, where hundreds of Christians were killed by Druze and Muslim mobs. In response, French troops occupied Lebanon for years. Within the palace, a quieter transformation was unfolding. Sultans like Abdulmajid I and his brother Abdulaziz increasingly relied on modern advisors, European architects, and secular ministers. The imperial court itself became hybridized, filled with French furniture, Ottoman calligraphy, Turkish coffee, and European etiquette. But for all the modernization, the empire was politically fragile. Abdulaziz, 1861-1876, spent lavishly on military modernization, ordering ironclad warships, expanding the army, and building new barracks. Istanbul's skyline filled with stone bridges, new palaces like Dolmabahce, and wide boulevards modelled on Paris. Yet his extravagance and the debt that funded it alienated both conservatives and reformers. In 1876, after a series of economic crises and political scandals, Abdulaziz was deposed by a coup and later found dead in his palace, an apparent suicide still debated by historians. His nephew, the young and idealistic Murad V, reigned for just 93 days before being declared mentally unfit. And then, out of this storm of upheaval, emerged a new kind of Ottoman ruler, one who would fuse autocracy with reform, faith with absolutism, and lead the empire into its most paradoxical era yet. His name was Abdülhamid II, and he would rule not with roses and reforms, but with silence, censorship, and the flickering promise of constitutionalism. By the final decades of the 19th century, the once invincible Ottoman Empire was widely referred to in European capitals as the sick man of Europe. The phrase, though disparaging, reflected a brutal truth: the empire remained vast in territory, but hollowed out in strength. Reform had failed to create unity. Debt had undermined sovereignty. Nationalism was tearing at the seams. Yet, as Europe watched for the empire's death rattle, the Ottomans instead entered a strange and paradoxical era, one of tenacious survival, deep suspicion, and quiet revolution. At the centre of this contradiction stood Sultan Abdülhamid II, who came to power in 1876 following a coup and the brief, troubled reign of his cousin, Murad V. Abdülhamid was complex educated, devout, intellectually curious but also secretive, controlling, and deeply wary of the modern world he was forced to engage with. Upon ascending the throne, Abdülhamid made a bold and hopeful gesture. He approved the first Ottoman constitution in late 1876. It established a bicameral parliament, civil rights for all Ottoman subjects, and limits on the Sultan's power. Newspapers hailed it as the dawn of constitutional monarchy. Reformers, known as the Young Ottomans, celebrated their triumph. It lasted just 2 years. In 1878, with the empire on the verge of collapse after another war with Russia, the disastrous Russo-Turkish War, 1877-78, Abdülhamid suspended the constitution, dissolved the parliament, and declared a return to absolute rule. His reasoning: the empire could not afford the chaos of politics during an existential crisis. To many, this made sense. The Russian war had ended in disaster, Ottoman forces were routed in the Balkans, and the empire was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of San Stefano, later revised by the Congress of Berlin. Bulgaria became a large, autonomous principality. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro gained full independence. Bosnia and Herzegovina were occupied by Austria-Hungary. Nearly all of the Ottoman Empire's European possessions were lost not through conquest, but diplomacy. It was a bitter humiliation. In response, Abdülhamid turned inward. For the next 30 years, he would rule as an autocrat, surrounded by spies, isolated in his palaces, and obsessed with controlling every piece of information that moved through the empire. His reign became known as the Hamidian era. Abdülhamid's rule was defined by paranoia and paternalism. He censored newspapers, banned political parties, and prohibited even foreign novels deemed subversive. European classics like Les Misérables and The Count of Monte Cristo were banned, not because of their content, but because of the mere presence of themes like rebellion and justice. And yet, paradoxically, his era was also one of modernization. Abdülhamid expanded the railway network, building the famed Hejaz Railway from Damascus to Medina, a feat of engineering that connected distant corners of the empire and served pilgrims on the Hajj. He invested in telegraph lines, public schools, and modern hospitals. Under his rule, Istanbul University was reformed, and a generation of bureaucrats, engineers, and doctors were trained under increasingly professional standards. One of his key tools of control was education. Abdülhamid established hundreds of new state schools, not just in Istanbul but across the provinces. These schools taught Ottoman Turkish, Islamic ethics, and history that glorified the dynasty. Students were instilled with loyalty to the Sultan Caliph and suspicion of foreign influence. But among these same students, seeds of rebellion were already sprouting. Indeed, Abdülhamid's grip on power relied heavily on a vast surveillance apparatus. He employed over 200 secret police officers, countless informants, and required regular reports from every governor and judge across the empire. Ministers, generals, and poets lived under constant fear of arrest or sudden exile to distant corners of Anatolia. But perhaps the most controversial element of Abdülhamid's reign was his ideological turn toward pan-Islamism. Where earlier sultans had embraced a multi-ethnic Ottomanism, Abdülhamid emphasized his role as Caliph of Islam, the protector of Muslims everywhere. He sent emissaries to British India, Russian Central Asia, and French North Africa, encouraging loyalty among colonized Muslims to the Ottoman throne. His propaganda machine produced Arabic, Persian, and Swahili publications extolling Islamic unity under Ottoman leadership. To European powers, this was dangerous. To many Muslims under colonial rule, it was inspiring. To non-Muslims inside the empire, particularly in the Balkans and Anatolia, it was alienating. And it had consequences. Tensions between Muslims and Christians worsened, especially in Armenia, where growing nationalist movements sought autonomy. Between 1894 and 1896, during a wave of unrest and rebellion, massacres of Armenian civilians occurred across eastern Anatolia, later known as the Hamidian massacres. Estimates of the death toll range from 100,000 to 300,000. Abdülhamid claimed he was suppressing separatist insurgents. Critics called it state-sponsored terror. It would cast a long shadow over the empire's final years. Still, his reign was not without support. Many provincial Muslims admired his piety, his opposition to European interference, and his commitment to Islamic values. He kept the empire together even as revolutions shook Europe and colonial powers carved up Asia and Africa. But time was catching up with him. By the early 20th century, a new opposition force had emerged, educated, secular, and deeply frustrated by censorship and absolutism. These were the Young Turks, many of whom had fled into exile, organised in Paris, Cairo, and Geneva. They dreamed not of preserving empire, but of reinventing it. Their slogans were not about God and sultans. They were about constitution, liberty, and nation. And in 1908, while Abdülhamid slept in Yıldız Palace, a group of junior officers in the Balkans mutinied. They marched not toward rebellion, but toward restoration of the very constitution Abdülhamid had suspended 30 years before. The Sultan, cornered by events he could no longer control, reluctantly agreed. The constitution was reinstated, parliament was reopened, censorship was lifted, a new chapter had begun. But it was not the return to glory many hoped for. It was the beginning of the end. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet footsteps of a marching army led by junior officers, intellectuals, and exiles who had grown up under the heavy shadow of Sultan Abdülhamid II's authoritarianism. Their goal was not to destroy the empire, but to save it through reform, to resuscitate the dream of a constitutional monarchy and a modern, unified Ottoman identity. And at first, it seemed to work. Abdülhamid, caught off guard and without the means to resist, reinstated the 1876 constitution, dissolved his spy network, and reopened the Ottoman parliament. Political parties reappeared overnight. Newspapers flourished with unrestrained energy, and debates that had long simmered in secret erupted into the open. The revolution had been engineered by the Committee of Union and Progress Cup, a political organisation made up of Ottoman military officers, bureaucrats and students, many of whom had studied in Western-style schools. They believed in science, secularism and centralisation. Their heroes were Bismarck and Napoleon. They saw the empire's future not in sultans and saints, but in parliaments, railroads and rational governance. But unity proved elusive. The Ottoman Empire was, after all, a state of many nations: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, Albanians, Bulgarians, Circassians. The Cup's rhetoric of Ottomanism sounded promising all subjects equal under the law, regardless of faith or ethnicity. But their practice leaned toward Turkification, the promotion of Turkish language, Turkish history, and a centralised Turkish state. For many, this was betrayal. In the Balkans, Christian populations demanded more than equality, they wanted autonomy or independence. In the Arab provinces, intellectuals began promoting Arab nationalism, publishing newspapers and founding literary clubs. Among Armenians, old grievances, especially after the Hamidian massacres, had hardened into suspicion and the quiet building of underground militias. What was meant to unify the empire instead revealed its cracks. In 1909, just a year after the revolution, Abdülhamid's supporters attempted a counter-coup, a conservative uprising in Istanbul demanding a return to Islamic law. The mutiny was crushed by Cup-aligned troops, and Abdülhamid was officially deposed. He was replaced by Mehmed V, a docile figurehead with no real power. The empire now belonged to the Young Turks. But the clock was ticking. Between 1911 and 1913, the empire suffered three devastating blows that shook it to its core. First came the Italo-Turkish War, 1911-1912. Italy, seeking to build its own colonial empire, invaded Ottoman-held Libya. Despite fierce local resistance, including from a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, the Ottomans were defeated. They ceded Libya and the Dodecanese Islands to Italy, a bitter loss of Muslim territory and strategic ports. Then, worse, the Balkan Wars 1912-1913. In a stunningly coordinated campaign, a coalition of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro launched a surprise attack on Ottoman Europe. Within months, the Ottomans lost nearly all of their remaining European territory, including Thessaloniki, Skopje, and Janina. The Ottoman presence in the Balkans, once seen as permanent, vanished almost overnight. The final blow came from within in 1913 following military defeats and political chaos. The Cup carried out a coup d'etat, sidelining parliament and installing a military-dominated dictatorship. Power now concentrated in the hands of a triumvirate known as the Three Pashas Enver, Talat and Cemal. Each was young, ambitious, and convinced that only absolute control could save the empire. Their solution was a new vision of Ottoman identity, no longer pluralistic, but aggressively centralised and militarised. The Cup began implementing policies aimed at assimilating or suppressing minority groups. Kurdish revolts were crushed, Arabic was restricted in schools, Armenian political parties were infiltrated and harassed. Dissent was no longer tolerated, even among former allies. But one strange, almost ironic twist unfolded during this authoritarian turn. The cities began to modernise rapidly. Istanbul saw the rise of streetcars, gaslights, and department stores. Ottoman women, especially in the capital, began organising for education and legal reform. Newspapers debated socialism, Darwinism, feminism, and spiritual revival. Coffee houses hosted fiery conversations about revolution and reform, often under the watchful eyes of government censors. It was a time of deep contradictions. A cosmopolitan elite in Istanbul embraced European fashions, read German newspapers, and travelled to Paris for opera, while Anatolian villages still operated under medieval rhythms, without roads, plumbing, or schools. The Cup sent engineers to build railroads and hospitals, but also built prisons and exile camps for political dissidents. One quirky but symbolic invention from this era, the Turkish typewriter. Previously, Ottoman script had been written by hand due to its flowing, Arabic-based form, but now, to match bureaucratic speed and Western forms, typists began developing mechanical solutions. It didn't fully catch on until later, but the idea captured the essence of the Young Turk paradox, a new machine for an old empire. Still, many Ottoman citizens believed the Cup could pull off a revival. The empire had weathered worse, its bureaucracy remained deep, its army was large, its population despite losses was still tens of millions. If only the empire could avoid more war, stabilise its economy, and continue reforms, perhaps it could remain a major power. But the world had other plans. In June 1914, an Austrian archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo. Europe, tied in webs of alliance and fear, began to mobilise. By August, the world was at war. And the Ottomans, at first neutral, faced an agonising choice. Side with Britain and France, who had propped up the empire diplomatically but humiliated it in war. Or side with Germany and Austria-Hungary, newer allies, but promising military modernisation and recovery of lost lands. The decision would be made by Enver Pasha behind closed doors without public debate. The Ottoman Empire, ancient, bruised, and unsteady, would throw its lot in with the Central Powers. It was a gamble with everything on the table, and it would lead directly into catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War not with a declaration but with a manoeuvre. On October 29, 1914, Ottoman warships, under German command, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. The response was swift. Within days, Russia, Britain, and France declared war on the empire. The decision to join the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary had been made in secret by Enver Pasha, the empire's Minister of War and one of the ruling triumvirate. Enver believed that war would allow the Ottomans to reclaim lost territory, reverse decline, and secure a seat at the table of modern empires. But what followed was not resurgence, it was disintegration. The Ottoman military, while large on paper, was unprepared for a global conflict. Its soldiers were undertrained, its logistics overstretched, and its leadership split between traditionalists and German advisors. The empire faced war on multiple fronts, each one testing its limits and its soul. The most famous and most tragic of these was Gallipoli. In 1915, British and Anzac Australian and New Zealand Army Corps forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in an attempt to force their way to Istanbul through the Dardanelles. The campaign, envisioned as a quick strike, turned into a grueling 10-month siege. Ottoman troops, led in part by a rising officer named Mustafa Kemal, held the cliffs with astonishing resilience. In one of history's most brutal stalemates, tens of thousands died on both sides, but the Ottomans prevailed. The Allies withdrew in 1916, leaving behind a victory that would become mythologized in Turkish memory and forever associate Mustafa Kemal with national salvation. Yet Gallipoli was the exception. Elsewhere, the empire was losing. In the Caucasus, Ottoman forces suffered catastrophic defeats against Russia. Enver Pasha's winter campaign in 1915 resulted in tens of thousands of soldiers freezing to death, a strategic disaster, matched only by the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire. In the Arab provinces, a greater challenge was unfolding. Spurred by promises of independence from British agents like Lawrence, the infamous Lawrence of Arabia, Arab tribal leaders began to revolt against Ottoman authority. The Arab Revolt 1916 to 1918, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons Faisal and Abdullah, targeted Ottoman garrisons, railways and cities. It was both a rebellion and a betrayal aided by British gold, rifles, and intrigue. But the darkest chapter of the war, and one of the darkest in Ottoman history, was unfolding within its own borders. Beginning in 1915, the Ottoman government initiated the mass deportation and killing of Armenians living in eastern Anatolia. Accused by the Cup of collaborating with Russian forces and harbouring separatist ambitions, Armenian communities were rounded up, marched into deserts, and massacred. Entire villages were emptied, intellectuals were executed, women and children were forced into labour or driven into Syria without food or shelter. While exact numbers remain debated, estimates of the death toll range from 800,000 to over 1.5 million. The events are known today as the Armenian Genocide, a term recognised by many historians and governments, though still officially denied by the Turkish Republic. The Ottomans claimed it was a wartime necessity. The evidence tells a different story, one of premeditated ethnic cleansing, coordinated by high-level officials, including Talat Pasha. The genocide shattered the empire's reputation, galvanised international condemnation, and irreparably severed centuries-old ties between Muslims and Christians within Anatolia. Meanwhile, on the Mesopotamian front, British forces advanced through southern Iraq, capturing Baghdad in 1917. In Palestine, General Edmund Allenby's forces took Jerusalem that same year. The empire was bleeding from every corner. And yet, the Cup remained in power, increasingly authoritarian and disconnected from reality. Newspapers were censored, dissenters jailed, and pan-Islamic propaganda ramped up to rally morale. But by 1918, the illusion could no longer be maintained. Germany was collapsing, Austria-Hungary was fracturing, and the Ottoman economy was in ruins. Food shortages plagued Istanbul, soldiers deserted en masse, morale evaporated. On October 30th, 1918, the Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively surrendering to the Allies. The war was over, but the Empire's nightmare had just begun. British, French, Italian, and Greek troops soon occupied Ottoman territory, including Istanbul itself. In 1919, the Treaty of Sèvres, a punitive peace deal, proposed dismembering the empire entirely. Anatolia would be carved up between Greece, France, Armenia, and Kurdish provinces. The Straits would be placed under international control. The Sultan would remain, but as a puppet. It was a national humiliation, and many Ottomans, especially the military, refused to accept it. One of them was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. In 1919, Kemal left Istanbul and travelled to Samsun, on the Black Sea coast. There, he began organising what would become the Turkish War of Independence, a grassroots movement to expel foreign occupiers, abolish the Sultanate, and create a new republic. But as the resistance grew, the empire's government in Istanbul grew weaker. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, was caught between foreign pressure and internal collapse. Cup leaders fled into exile. Talat and Enver were assassinated by Armenian vigilantes. Kemal was gunned down in Georgia. The empire was leaderless, and by 1922 it was no longer sovereign. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished by the newly formed Turkish Grand National Assembly. Mehmed VI boarded a British warship and sailed into exile the last Ottoman Sultan, disappearing into history without ceremony or salute. After 623 years, the Ottoman Empire was dead. But a new state forged in war, fire, and radical reform was rising in its place. And the man leading it would erase the old order with unprecedented speed. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in Ankara. Its leader, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, had already become a legend, the general who saved Anatolia, the architect of modern Turkish identity, and the man who buried 6 centuries of Ottoman rule in one revolutionary breath. The Ottoman Caliphate, once the spiritual centre of Sunni Islam, lingered for a moment longer until March 3rd, 1924, when it too was abolished by Ataturk's government. The remaining male members of the Ottoman dynasty were exiled. Their palaces were emptied, their titles dissolved. And with that, the Ottoman Empire faded from the world map. But not from the world's memory. For 6 centuries, the empire had been a defining power in global history. It had conquered Constantinople and held Mecca. It had threatened Vienna and ruled North Africa. It had produced law codes, mosques, poetry, and cities. It had overseen diversity and authoritarianism, religious tolerance and brutal purges, golden ages and genocides. And it left behind a complicated legacy. In the new Turkish Republic, that legacy was viewed with suspicion, even contempt. Ataturk sought to erase it. Arabic script was replaced with Latin letters. Ottoman vocabulary was purged from Turkish, and Islamic law was replaced with a secular civil code modelled on Switzerland's. Fez hats were banned. European suits became mandatory in public life. Istanbul, once the heart of empire, was no longer even the capital. Ataturk wanted Turkey to be modern, Western, and rational, not the heir of sultans and seraglios. But the Ottoman ghost refused to vanish. In the Arab world, especially among Islamists and nationalists, the Ottoman legacy is mixed. Some remember it as a golden age, a time when Muslims were united under a powerful caliphate, resisting European colonialism. Others view it as an imperial occupation that suppressed local cultures, languages, and aspirations. In the Balkans, the memory is equally divided. Ottoman rule is often remembered as foreign domination, a centuries-long colonization that left lasting scars. Yet Ottoman architecture, cuisine, music, and even surnames remain embedded in daily life from Sarajevo to Skopje. In Europe, the empire was once a feared opponent, the Turk synonymous with invasion. Yet it was also a subject of fascination, the Orient of opera stages, the mystery behind the veil. Western scholars have long studied the empire's fall, often asking, why did it decline, could it have survived? There is no simple answer. Some argue the Ottomans failed to modernize fast enough, clinging to outdated military and administrative structures. Others suggest that it was too diverse to survive the age of nationalism. Still others blame the interference of European powers, who constantly played internal factions against each other. But one thing is certain: the Ottoman legacy lives on. In architecture, the domes of Sinan still define Istanbul's skyline. In language, Ottoman Turkish words still pepper modern Turkish, Arabic, Bosnian, and Albanian. In law, many Middle Eastern legal codes evolved from late Ottoman reforms. In religion, the empire's centuries-long role as protector of Sunni Islam remains a point of pride for many. Even in modern geopolitics, echoes remain. In Turkey, the 21st century has seen a revival of Ottoman nostalgia, particularly under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who frequently references the empire's grandeur. Television dramas like Dirilish Ertuğrul and Payitaht Abdülhamid attract millions, blending myth with history, stoking nationalist pride and Islamic identity. In Greece, Bulgaria, and the Arab world, historical memory still shapes how states relate to Turkey: mistrust, admiration, resentment, and shared heritage woven into diplomatic friction and cultural exchange. One quirky yet telling legacy, the Ottoman calligraphic style, once used to inscribe Quranic verses and royal edicts, now influences modern Turkish graphic design and branding. Logos for banks, universities, and even tech startups often nod to the curved elegance of imperial script, a subtle aesthetic echo of power long past. Perhaps that is the Ottoman Empire's final paradox. It died in 1922, but it never entirely disappeared. It lives in memory, debate, design, and geopolitics, in the minarets of Cairo, the markets of Damascus, the bridges of Mostar, and the palaces of Istanbul, in its greatness and cruelty, its sophistication and stagnation, the empire left an imprint so vast it cannot be confined to any one identity. It was Islamic, yes, but also secular in its law. It was Turkish, but ruled over Arabs, Greeks, Jews, and Armenians. It conquered in blood, but also governed in law. It brought peace, and it wrought war. And it lasted longer than Rome. In the end, the Ottoman Empire is not a singular story. It is a tapestry torn, repaired, embroidered, and finally folded away. But if you listen carefully, beneath the hum of modern Istanbul or the silence of its ruined caravanserais, you might still hear the echo of a marching band, the rustle of imperial robes, or the haunting call of a muezzin raised beneath a dome that once declared, "Here rules the shadow of God on earth.